These things are within our control, Fran. The Prime Minister has set out a very clear, well-delineated period of time in which this engagement will take place. The P8 for a month later this year, and commencing in January, a frigate for a period of 6 months. We always manage these things in our own national interests and in relation to our own national security, and we will continue to do so in this case.
G'day guys, and today I thought I'd make a video just spitballing about why I think Australia is getting involved in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, my first thought upon hearing of Australia's involvement was that we're attempting to honour our military agreement with the United States. Now, the United States and Australia, under the ANZUS Treaty, as far as I understand it, have essentially an agreement to look to each other's interests when each other are threatened. So I figured it was Australia doing that because, as I see it, Australia has a very one-sided relationship with this treaty, because obviously the United States doesn't need our help as much as we need their help. The United States, of course, being the most powerful military in the world, enormous nuclear state, massive military and that sort of stuff, whereas Australia is a smaller nation with a smaller military, backed up next to another superpower in the form of China, also a massive nuclear and military state, as well as other countries like Indonesia with massively huge populations compared to ours, and obviously trickling down into the size of their military. So obviously we need a military guarantor more than the United States does. So that was my first thought on the situation there. We were just essentially following the United States to war once again, as we have done, I believe, in every single major conflict since following the Second World War. We followed the United States around into Korea and Vietnam and those sorts of things. But I was doing some reading, as it's always good to do before you make videos talking about things that you might not understand too hot. And obviously Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison was coming out to the media and explaining about why he was doing these things and that sort of thing. And he mentioned an interesting stat, and he said that 15% of Australia's crude oil and 30% of Australia's refined oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz. So obviously this means if this region becomes destabilised, then Australia has has an enormous economic threat, because obviously industrialised economies run on fuel. Now, a big problem for Australia is that Australia has an incredibly low stockpile of fuel. So if we run off data from 2017, we can see that Australia only has 21 days of petrol stocks, 16 days of diesel, and 19 days of aviation fuel essentially stored around the country. Now, this is a massive problem if Australia was under any kind of military threat, or we had to enter into a protracted campaign, because we won't be able to run our planes, tanks, vehicles, even just the local economy will begin to break down, because goods and services and resources will not be able to be shipped over the country. So Australia's in a massive problem fuel-wise, and obviously this ties into the economic and military situation of Australia. Now, I will grant you that is data from 2017, but if we have a look at a more recent piece of data from just earlier this month, the 5th of August 2019, published on ABC News, we can see that Australia is looking to access US fuel reserves to shore up its own supplies. And this is obviously a reaction to tensions in the Persian Gulf. So it says Australia is eyeing off the United States' tightly guarded fuel reserves as it seeks to overcome having less of a third of the stocks it should. And this article again claims that Australia has just 28 days worth of fuel imports, which is well below the 90-day minimum required under international agreements and that sort of thing. The Australian government is in the very early stages of constructive discussions with the United States about the potential to access their strategic petroleum reserve, which would greatly boost our own stocks and also the flexibility of supply. So that's coming from Defence Minister Linda Reynolds. So the strategic reserve of the US contains tens of millions of barrels of oil and is the world's largest emergency fuel supply. So obviously if we can get a hold of that, it'd be pretty cool. Now obviously questions were raised as to why doesn't Australia just develop its own stocks here? Well, the Defence Minister, or the Energy Minister, Angus Taylor I should say, says it would be cheaper to actually import the fuel when we need it, rather than build a reserve here. Now, this seems like a bit of a flawed solution to the problem for me, and I'll try and outline it simply here. So essentially the problem is that Australia, due to not producing much of its own oil, relies on imports from the Middle East. And to alleviate this problem of relying on imports from the Middle East in times of national crisis and emergency and military threat and that sort of thing, we're going to instead rely on imports from the United States. So the problem stems from importation and we're going to get around this problem via importation. How much fucking sense does that make? Doesn't seem to make much sense to me, but then again, I am just one of the little people, one of the serfs of Australia, so, fuck me, am I right? The Maritime Union of Australia describes the government's move as a fundamentally flawed solution, arguing a lack of Australian-flagged oil tankers meant it would be very difficult to source the fuel quickly in an emergency. Trying to game the system by negotiating access to another country's fuel reserves, yet having no strategic fleet of tankers to bring that fuel to Australia, is nothing more than a stopgap solution that has the illusion of taking action while leaving the country no better off. Yeah, that's a pretty good point. I mean, if we are backed up against, other superpowers like China and other naval threats in the area, how are we even going to get to this fuel into Australia? It's just going to be sitting in ports in America waiting for the naval blockade of Australia to end, and I guess, within the month, Australia runs out of petrol, and then we're truly fucked. We're not going to be able to mount any significant resistance at that point. The local economy will collapse, and we'll be in big trouble. There'll be internal strife, and, internal strife just makes us easy pickings for other nations. So, yeah, we got to up our game, guys. We got to develop some fuel reserves in Australia, and we've got to stop selling off infrastructure to fucking China, because maybe Australia's national security interests should come first before politicians getting kickbacks. Not that I'm making any accusations, of course. It just seems very suspect that so many people are willing to sell off our infrastructure to foreign interests. Maybe we should think about putting some fuel underground here. That might be a good idea. Australia's involvement in the Strait of Hormuz seems to me to stem from both our desire to protect our oil imports and our desire to buddy up to the United States, potentially as a bargaining chip or a condition for us gaining access to their fuel reserve. So obviously the fuel situation and the defence situation are very closely tied up, as I've explained with my analysis of Australia's fuel resources. In case you weren't paying attention, we don't have any. And we're desperately hoping the US will give us some, with no plan of how we're going to get the fuel into Australia. If Australia is navally blockaded, well, we're fucked, and if Australia needs to get it over really quickly, we don't have a fleet of tankers to get it here. But don't worry, guys, the government basically has control over everything. The government basically has control over everything in your life here in Australia, but don't worry, they're really competent and they make really smart decisions. Anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Please let me know what you think down in the comments below. Thanks all for sticking around, and have a good one.